some slides to finish up and present some options to the committee.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this first slide is a reminder of the provincial formula that was used to determine the funding that the FERD received. The next slide here expands the electoral areas to review the calculation in more detail, seeing the population and the allocation of the provincial grant dollars of the $162,000 on how the province determined how they were going to dole out the funds to the regional district. So on the far right is the funding that we have already allocated based upon the need. So to date, $180,000 has been allocated, and it's distributed accordingly in this table. Okay. This next slide looks at the population. When we received the funds from the provincial government, they calculated the distribution of the dollars based on the 2018 electoral area population of 19,967. So when we look at that compared to the whole regional district population, it amounts to 6.15% of the regional district population. Okay, so the next series of slides that I will present are presenting options to support hardships faced by electoral areas, more specifically funding options of how to fairly allocate the dollars to each electoral area to support nonprofit community groups that have experienced hardship due to the global pandemic. When we look at the options that we present today, we recommend that in order to provide the greatest flexibility to support those community nonprofit organizations facing hardship, it is best to align with our existing grant and aid policy, which is broad enough to capture a variety of community nonprofits, but of course, it's in alignment with our legislation that restricts the benefits being offered to businesses. So it's to truly to give out funds to nonprofit organizations. So each of these options are to look different ways of coming up with funds to the electoral areas to funnel the money to your grant and aid budgets to help support nonprofit organizations that are facing COVID hardships. Okay, so the first option looks at the total grant received, the regional grant of the 1.36 million. And then it takes the 6.15% of the population and it calculates that at just under $84,000. So in this scenario, we said, why don't we divide by 8 electoral areas, and we could give a flat amount to each electoral area to be used through your grant and aid budgets. So that would be just under $10,500 to each electoral area. And that would bring the balance of the funds remaining to be allocated from $502,000 to just over $419,000. Option 2, it takes that same 6.15% of the $1.3 million grant, yet it calculates the amounts attributable to each electoral area based on population. So the funds allocated on this basis range from approximately $3,500 in electoral area A to just over $14,000 in electoral area C. Again, because it was still based on the just shy of $84,000, the balance remaining is $419,000 to carry us through 2021 as funds remaining to be allocated. And lastly, the third option takes a little bit of a different angle, a different approach on what we might consider an option. It calculates the amounts attributable to each electoral area based on the population, but it uses the regional amount per capita. So when the provincial government gave us the $1.362 million, we saw that there were three levels of calculation that went into that. And the first one was a $3.10 per capita amount for every person attributable to the population in the whole regional district. So we said, what if we took that $3.10 and allocated it to the electoral area population? It comes up with just under $62,000, and you can see that there's a range, of course, based on population. And this would leave the balance of funds remaining to just over $441,000 to be allocated during the remainder of 2021. I have a summary slide that will conclude the presentation today. So there's 3 options, and these are all, we heard that there were a lot of hardships in the electoral areas faced by nonprofit community groups. So we are looking at ways to try and find dollars that we could just to distinguish and set aside for the local area directors to use to support your nonprofit nonprofit community groups that are facing hardships. And we are recommending that these would be used through the grant and aid policy that already exists. We have a tried and true application process. So the first option, it's a flat amount per electoral area, and it's just under 10,500. Option 2 is a percentage based on population, and it's looking at the overall amount to the population for electoral areas as compared to the total regional district. So 6.15%, and it just attributes different amounts to each electoral area. And lastly, the third option is a calculation of $3.10 to align that regional district amount, and it calculates it based on the population for each electoral area. And I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lounsborough. So here we are, directors. We have 3 options to choose from. Maybe before we get started, I'd like to point out that the funding formula that many electoral area directors have taken issue with was determined by the provincial government. We aren't here to discuss that today. We're here to take a look at the funding that has been awarded by the provincial government to the electoral areas and try and decide which of these 3 options is the one that we would like to support. Okay, discussion, directors.
Bales.
Director Bales. Director Dixon, were you also in line?
Yeah, please.
Thank you.
Okay, it seems like we've already used another option other than these 3 to bring down the deficit in services in some areas, but not others. So I'm wondering, like, if it goes to a grant and aid, I already have a fairly good budget for grant and aid, and but I'd like to see something that's easier to utilize, because you only have so many volunteers willing to do the work in grants and aid. So I don't know that I'll get that much more need in a grant and aid fund, but allocating it to get some kind of services or that are needed during COVID. For instance, signage. We could use some signage in Area C. I noticed in one of the first early PowerPoint that there's Area C and F seem to have the biggest population, but we haven't gotten very many funds as far as per capita, as far as equitable per capita. So I'm just wondering if we could have a 4th option of utilizing the funds to decrease hardships, or just utilize it on things that have happened as a result of COVID, and maybe signage, or I haven't had time to really think about it. It'd be nice to have some time to think about something that would help people to bring costs down or to make things a little bit better that have resulted as.
Okay, thank you, Director Bales, for your comments. Director Dixon.
Whoops. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You may have said this, Ms. Lounsborough, I had to slip away for a phone call. If, doesn't matter which option we went, would those funds have to be spent by December 2021, the end of the year?
No, we would be deeming this as allocated, and we would report on it as such. So then you wouldn't have to spend it by the end of this year.
Good. Thank you, Director Dixon and Ms. Lounsborough. Any other directors? Director Stobart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the big things we've been talking about over this time, over the last while here, is about equity. And again, this is something that'll certainly it'll have to go through full board as well. So I'm certainly in support of option number 3, which will give us the same amount as was given to the rest of the regional district.
Okay, thank you, Director Stobart. Other discussion?
Davidson?
Director Davidson, go ahead.
So just cycling back to our agenda for today, as I understand it, this is just for information only. There's no motion before us today. And if that is indeed the case, I guess what I'm looking for is just some time to look at the numbers. You know, I'd like to get a copy of the presentation from staff. And I'd like to better understand the things that were happening. We were talking about 20 minutes ago. But the other thing that anytime we get into the subject of allocation, questions come to mind, such as do they include First Nations reserve populations as well? I know that we did one formula including that for the community works funds, and I'm assuming that the provincial allocation also included First Nation.
That's correct. Those numbers were provided to
populations
us.
as well.
That's correct, Director Davidson.
Okay. All right. Anyway, I would just like, to be honest, time to look at the numbers that you presented today at greater leisure and greater detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Davidson. So staff, timelines on a motion regarding how this might be allocated. What would staff's suggestion be?
We certainly didn't bring forward a recommendation. This was not something that we brought forward. This was at the request of East. My only concern would be with respect to the allocation of the remaining funds and for the flexibility for your CAO and CFO to be able to use those funds as we continue to go through this pandemic. Without knowing what the desires are of the board, it makes it very challenging for us to access any of those remaining funds for ongoing initiatives and projects that are happening to meet the work plan needs.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kinnaman. Directors, any further comments?
I think, sorry, Adamson, I just think this is ridiculous. Electoral directors get nothing and the city gets twice. Like, it's wrong. Right?
So once again, Director Adamson, the funding formula was put together by the province. It wasn't put together by the staff at the regional district. The staff are trying to accommodate the electoral areas in any way possible to try and allocate this funding. So I think we really need to focus on that.
Well, have we complained to the province? Have we wrote a letter? Have we done anything like that?
I believe on the last board agenda, there was a letter going to Victoria expressing our concerns with the way the funding formula was determined.
Have we got an answer?
No, Mr. Chair, we have not gotten an answer through to Director Adams. I can confirm that letter has been sent.
Great. So we should see how they answer it before we start spending the money. Maybe it'll be different. I don't know, hopefully.
Thank you, Director Adamson. Any other discussion from directors?
Bales,
Director Bales.
I echo kind of what Director Davidson was saying, and I think we need more time to simmer on this and maybe possibly come up with an option 4 or 5. I don't know. Just if there is a possibility of another option or 2. And I don't think the whole distribution between electoral areas has been per capita fair, and I would like to see something more along those lines because a lot of them, the funds have already been used up, and I'd like to think of some possible uses that really will help people during these tough times. I don't know if I just really don't think that our volunteers will necessarily be totally up to the challenge to utilize more money than they already have available, at least in my grant and aid. So I would like to think of other things that that we can choose to do as directors to utilize this money to make it just to do something that will help the communities during this time.
Okay, thank you, Director Bales. Maybe I might point out that this money, even though it goes to a grant and aid, it doesn't have to be dispersed this year, so it can be moved into future years, and that would mean that your residents don't have to contribute as much through the next budgets to grant and aids. Any other directors with discussion? So it sounds like directors would like some time to think about this. Staff, would it be okay if we deferred this to the April East meeting?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Do we need a motion to that effect?
And if we could just,
Director Davidson.
sorry, Chair Davidson. I was again hoping we can get something electronic to look at and just sort of review those numbers. I was just rechecking the HTML agenda. I didn't see this slide deck there, but I may have missed it.
Pardon me, the which agenda, Director Davidson?
Director Davidson is just hoping to get a copy of the slide presentation sent to him.
Okay, good. All right, that would be okay, staff?
We can certainly send it to them in confidence, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we all
So-
get that, right? We'll all get a
Send it out
copy.
to everyone in confidence,
thank
Director
you.
Adamson.
Yeah, good.
Good, thank you. So staff, are we needing a motion regarding this issue, or should we just put it on the April East?
I think maybe a motion to refer this item back to East for further consideration for April would be in order. That way we don't put it on the board agenda for next week.
Good.
Moved, Engar.
Move Director Engar,
Second.
second Director Adamson. Any discussion on the referral? Hearing none, all in favor? Contrary, the motion carries.
And just looking for a motion to adjourn, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kinnaman. Motion to adjourn. Move Director Dixon, second Director Stovart. All in favor, contrary, motion carries. Thank you, staff. Thank you, directors.